The men had the idea of attaching a discarded crankshaft to a piston and adding gasoline to turn the handle. It was a failure, but it convinced Davidson that this was the engine they needed, because bicycles were the most common form of transportation in those days. Davidson, a working-class man, dreamed of owning a faster car, but on an outing, he overheard a worker trying to speed up by holding onto the car in front of him. At this moment, an idea to revolutionize the traditional industry quietly sprang up. If you add an engine to the bicycle, can have a faster speed. So he went to his friend Harley and told him what he was thinking. But Harley, who had studied engineering, thought it was a fantasy. Making an engine alone would be a huge undertaking. Not only would they need machine tools and molds and a workshop, but more importantly, they didn't have the financial backing to do it. And now they had nothing but an idea. But Davidson didn't want to give up, so, at his insistence, they sneaked into a theater where the actress was riding a tricycle in front of the screen. The audience was glued to the stage. But Harley was fascinated by the engine and the precise mechanics of the vehicle, which he hurriedly drew on his laptop. But the next moment they were spotted by the security guards who couldn't afford the tickets and they were kicked out. But Harley managed to draw a model of the engine from memory. With the drawings in hand, they immediately approached a local factory for cooperation, hoping that the owner could help them produce the engine. However, the owner took one look at the engine and rejected it because in his eyes, Harley and Davidson were just a couple of kids, not to mention the fact that the frame of the bike couldn't handle the horsepower. The lack of factory support didn't discourage them from developing their own engine, and it was this decision that in the near future created for them a famous motorcycle brand with more than 1 million members in 115 countries. After much deliberation, they turned the abandoned warehouse at Davidson's home into a makeshift workshop. Without the necessary parts for the engine, Davidson went to the factory where he worked and stole some parts. Not only that, they also used the factory's equipment to make the engine casing, and then Harley, the strongest brain, to assemble it. Soon the world's first Harley motorcycle engine was made by the duo. As they carefully poured gasoline into it, Harley cranked the handle with a serious look on his face.
No, come on! Come on!
What happened? These homebrewed parts aren't cutting it. We need precision machining and new parts, Arthur. We can't just keep cannibalizing everything.
That said, they didn't have the money to buy more sophisticated parts. At a loss for words, Davidson suddenly thought of his cousin Walter, who owned hundreds of acres of farmland and was a railroad mechanic, and whose help would easily solve the problem. So he hurriedly asked Harley to write a letter to his cousin instead.
A motorized bicycle. The engine is strong and swift. She'll take you anywhere you're brave enough to point her. We could use some capital. $75 for marketing and such. We'll gladly repay you with interest. Initial estimates put sales in the hundreds.
Don't be ridiculous, Arthur.
Maybe you're right. Initial estimates put sales in the thousands.
This exaggerated description made Walter curious, so he packed his bags and went to find out what was going on. But when he arrived at the 10-square-meter cabin, he was shocked by what he saw, which was completely different from Davidson's description. He felt cheated and was about to leave, but then the drawings on the wall attracted Walter's attention. Looking at the precise structural design, Walter was completely impressed by Harley's talent. So after a few moments of thought, he finally decided to stay. Then the railroad mechanic pointed out the engine's problem, and so the world's first Harley motorcycle was born. The trio couldn't wait to get outside and test it out. With the engine roaring to life, they finally took the first step towards what was then the most common form of transportation, the bicycle. So when Walter rode his first motorcycle, he became the talk of the town. He rode through the busy streets like a wild horse in a green field. Sometime later, a muddy Walter returned to the factory, but he couldn't take his eyes off the motorcycle. He asked Harley if he could make it faster, and Harley confidently told him that if he had the money, it could go faster. Walter, no longer hesitant, pulled his entire fortune out of his pocket and decided to take a stake in the company. Not only that, but he said he would sell all his farms to support them, because he had seen the future of Harley in the ride he had just taken. But the first thing they had to do was to develop the next generation of engines to get a head start on the amateur market. But while they were busy working on the power of the second generation motorcycle, a motorcycle named Indian suddenly beat them to the punch and successfully captured the market with a lot of capital. The emergence of the Indian motorcycle also made Walter feel the crisis, so they immediately rushed to develop the second generation of motorcycles overnight. But just at this time, Harley suddenly received a letter of acceptance from the university, which has always been dreaming of college. He was overjoyed. But when Davidson and Walt found out Harley was quitting, they hit rock bottom. Apparently, at the rate they're going, they can't get away from Harley's technical support. With his dream on one side and his best friend's commission on the other, Harley was caught in the middle and didn't know what to do. But in the end, he chose to quit. After all, it had been his and his family's hope to go to college. Without Harley's help, Davidson had to develop a new engine on his own. However, he encountered a problem. The new engine's carburetor was not working properly, and the fuel was not getting into the engine. To solve the problem, he went to Joe, the factory owner, who had turned them down before. But Joe was already an agent for Indian Motorcycles, and he knew that Davidson had built a motorcycle, so he asked him about the technology. When Davidson didn't want to talk, Joe brought out a special carburetor, and Eddie, an employee, saw it and kindly reminded Davidson that he'd better get Harley to take a look at it. But Davidson didn't take this to heart. With the return of Harley, the problem of engine oil leakage was easily solved. Under his direction, a full-fledged assembly line was formed in the factory, and a Harley-Davidson motorcycle was produced. What's even more incredible to Walter is that Harley designed the world's first V-twin engine in just 1 month. This gave their motorcycles even more horsepower. But that wasn't enough. Now that their biggest competitor, Indian Motorcycles, had taken over half the market, they had to get Harley more exposure, and the best way to do that was to enter a race. But this time, the race is a little different. This time, the venue is in the jungle. All the participants have to go around the field 3 times, which is not only a test of their skills, but also a major challenge to the durability of the motorcycle. At the signal of the judges, all the riders rush out. The muddy trail is very rough, but in order to win this crucial race, they all push the throttle to the maximum. But with the engines running at high power, some of the bikes are having problems. Some couldn't handle it and burst into flames, while others crashed into the ground when they couldn't avoid it. But even in this intense race, Harley and Indian were still in the lead, and the 2 sides were soon locked in a battle for position. But then Indian's rider slammed into Walter in an attempt to keep his balance, and Walter's right foot hit a rock, causing him to lose speed. He forced his way through the first lap, but when Eddie saw his injury, he decided to take his place in the race. But Walter refused. He poured a few mouthfuls of booze into his mouth and took off again on his Harley. He soon caught up with the Indians again, and this time he was able to kick them out of the race with a well-placed kick. This time, he kicked the Indian out of the race. But while the race was in full swing, Hendy had gotten all the dealers outside the arena to sell Indy motorcycles for a share of the company's stock. So to him, win or lose, they were the biggest winners in the race. And just as the deal was struck, Walt took first place on his Harley, and everyone gathered to celebrate the moment. But then Charlie came over and told him about Hendy's plan, which ignited Walter's anger.